Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian, and thanks for joining us for our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. Joining us today is Congressman Mike Gallagher, Wisconsin Republican, former Marine and PhD, who is the co-chair, along with Maine Independent Senator Angus King, of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, the 14-member panel that put together 75 thoughtful recommendations on how to improve the cyber deterrence and resilience of the United States. Sir, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You and Senator King issued a press release calling for improved K through 12 and actually beyond cyber education for all Americans. As you know, Senator King and I spoke on the podcast last week. What's the kind of training that's needed for all Americans, no matter how young or old, and why?
As we've analyzed this issue, and let me say it was an absolute pleasure to work with Senator King. It was fantastic, and this report really is a nonpartisan or bipartisan product. I think we spent so much time looking at cyber from the perspective of the federal government, NSA, FBI, ODNI, CIA, et cetera, that we underappreciate how many of our cyber vulnerabilities emerge merely from an employee in a small company that's a subcontractor for a larger company that is itself a subcontractor for Lockheed Martin, clicking on an email they shouldn't click. And I think what makes this fundamentally different than, let's say, deterrence during the early Cold War is that so much of the resilience and deterrence we need is concentrated not within the federal government, but concentrated within the private sector, and then particularly the 85% of the private sector that owns our critical infrastructure. So just from sort of the biggest picture perspective, we spend a lot of time thinking about how do you have, for lack of a better term, a Smokey the Bear campaign in cyber. How do you make basic cyber hygiene a part of K through 12 education? The other part of this, I'd say, is if you look at some of our biggest problems in the federal government, ultimately you conclude, similarly, this is a human problem. Our biggest cyber failures have been human failures. And ultimately, our ability to succeed will come down to whether we can convince the best and the brightest to work for or with the federal government. In fact, when we asked, top leaders of the NSA what keeps them up at night, they said retention. How do we retain the best and the brightest? So we have a variety of recommendations where we're trying to, if we can begin that pipeline of talented kids early on and find a way to get them working for or with the federal government, we think that puts us in a position to win any cyber competition in the future.
So talk to us a little bit about whether people get that, right? That does the population understand exactly how uninformed they are and how vulnerable they are? Because the entire system is paying an enormous amount of money in credit card theft, criminal activity, ransomware, right? I mean, when you add all of this up, it's not just a national security challenge, it's a national economic challenge, right? I mean, China has been stealing American technology blind, including some of our most classified weapons systems have been penetrated. There are all sorts of ways to do this. Do you think that there's sort of a national consensus of us, sort of like cyber anonymous, right? All of us are acknowledging our problem and are going to seek help?
Well, I think the short answer is no, to be brutally honest. I mean, a lot of what we've tried to do in the report is really not scare the American people, but at least apprise them of the threat. And that's part of why we took some non-traditional approaches. For example, if you open the report, the first page, you'll see kind of a fictional future scenario that we had some outside authors who wrote Ghost Fleet put together to really try and hammer home, at least to our colleagues on the Hill, the stakes of this. And I count myself among the many Americans who's thought that, or at least Americans who used to work for the federal government, who's thought that we've already gone through a series of cyber Pearl Harbors, but I've been astounded that we haven't woken up. So for example, a few years ago, I got a letter from OPM saying that my military records had been hacked. And I thought at the time that this would be the massive wake-up call that our country would need to take a different course. And for whatever reason, and I suspect it's because, at least until NotPetya, there hasn't been a massive attack at the intersection of physical destruction and certainly not death. But that's going to happen at some point. And so the whole goal of the Cyber Solarium Commission is to wake us up so that we can make the changes we need to make now, bureaucratically, budgetarily, in terms of general overall public awareness, in order to avoid a cyber 9/11. But it is going to require a greater public awareness effort and making sure that kids in Northeast Wisconsin understand that they too are on the front lines of cyber competition.
Two questions. One, what is the kind of cyber education you need, through life cyber education you need? And what's the role that Congress plays in making this a reality?
Well, we recommend that the U.S. government support basic and ongoing education in cyber at the K through 12 level. There's a variety of things it could do through the Department of Education, but also at collegiate and university levels through apprenticeships and more. We believe that cybersecurity needs to be incorporated into safety curricula as well for career and technical education programs focused on operational technology users, maintainers, and installers, particularly in the critical infrastructure field. So, perhaps a real world example would be Northeast Wisconsin Technical College. They have an energy education center on the west side of Green Bay here. Great program, right out of high school. In less than 7 months, you can be getting a job earning $70,000 a year working as a lineman for a utility company. Increasingly, it's important for even that person who may be repairing things to understand the cyber component of his or her job. So there's a variety of ways the federal government can incentivize that behavior at the state level in terms of K through 12 and then in higher education. We also think that it's critical, though, and perhaps even more important, to make the variety of cyber jobs that are available at the federal government, for lack of a better term, sexier than they are right now. So, for example, we have 33,000 cyber jobs that are vacant at the federal level and over 500,000 in the country. The question is, how do we fill that gap? And so there's a few things we recommend, like expanding and strengthening existing programs like CyberCore, which is CyberCore Scholarship for Service, an ROTC-like program for federal cyber employees. We recommend that growth go roughly from 300 per year right now to over 2,000 per year in 10 years. We also recommend Congress support ongoing efforts by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have a program called the National Initiative on Cybersecurity Education, which is researching the problem. And in particular, we want them and GEO to kind of take a look at how frequently candidates who would be up for these types of jobs don't pursue them because of security clearance delays. Our security clearance process needs to be modernized because we're losing people as a result of the delays. Finally, I just would say on a personal level, as someone who was in the military, I or strongly feel that we can improve our transition assistance program to get military veterans to go right into federal civilian cybersecurity jobs. So the bottom line is we believe that if we can make it easier to get clearance, and if it pays a little bit more, and if we can play to our strength, which is ultimately making the mission more exciting, and part of that is elevating certain federal government agencies like CISA to do their job, we can sort of capture the imagination of those kids that are in school right now poking around in cybersecurity.
One of the things you and Senator King talked about in your press release was the importance of, especially at this time of pandemic, Americans being more discriminating to detect disinformation and misinformation. How do you combat this? You and I have talked about this. When disinformation, can stem anywhere from the Oval Office to domestic news sources to foreign news sources that are trying to, or foreign governments that are trying to affect the debate and the discussion, as we found, whether in 2016, 2018, and even now in 2020, we're finding the Russians being far more active, or as active as they've ever been. What's the right way to do this?
So, such a good question. And as we're seeing right now, at a time when our country is dealing with a crisis, a healthcare crisis, potentially a pandemic, we have cyber actors that are trying to take advantage of it. We've had open source reports that there's Russian actors spreading misinformation, not only here, but in other European countries. Someone did a denial of service attack on HHS the other day. I think the best way to combat this, assuming you can't convince Americans to log off Twitter and get off Facebook, which would probably be the right approach. I say that as a very old school millennial who is skeptical of social media.
I like you're keeping it old school. That's well done.
Yeah. I do think we need to do a better job of naming and shaming such misinformation and propaganda activity. I believe right now, for example, we're not only at war with a virus, we're really at war with a coordinated Chinese Communist Party misinformation and propaganda campaign online. So one thing that I think would be wise for us to do is to see if we could prevail upon the patriotic impulses of the people that run companies like Twitter and say, you shouldn't allow the mouthpieces of foreign governments who don't allow their own citizens access to your platform to spread propaganda. And that gets at a bigger issue that we struggle with in the Cyber Solarium report. We don't want to go down the path of the Chinese Communist Party. We can't sort of mandate by fiat what our companies do, but we have to have a more productive working relationship between the private sector and the federal government. We need the federal government to be a better partner, pushing information to the private sector, providing them resources that are useful. But we also need the private sector to step up and strengthen their security posture, and ultimately unite us and our allies around free world values.
How much of this is the education system that needs to get involved in this? I mean, just as we have math, science, language standards, don't we need to actually be directing greater education at a lower level instead of looking at all of these external programs to help us at a fundamental level be investing in education in a way that generates not only cyber professionals, but if you go to any national security experts, they will tell you that what we actually need is scientists and engineers for the future where we're going, especially at a time when we may be dissuading immigrant engineers from coming to the United States, which is another challenge, as Mick Mulvaney discussed.
Yeah, so I would say a lot of our recommendations on investments in STEM areas are light touch in the report, and part of that is because so much of that is a state level discussion or states taking a lead in partnership with the federal government. Um, I'm all for it, and there's a variety of creative ways we can do it. And I do think we need to modernize our immigration system in a way where, for those who have skills that we need and who want to do it the right way and come here legally, we should be making it incredibly easy. And a lot of our best businesses are founded by first generation immigrants and things like that. And I don't think that comes at the expense of, Americans that are here already. So part of the challenge I'd say in this report is when you talk about cyber, it can quickly become everything. So we did have to exercise a lot of discipline of, this isn't a report about the future of education in America. This isn't a report about immigration. There are cyber aspects of that, but we don't propose to present a comprehensive solution to all of those bigger issues.
Congressman Gallagher, thanks so very much for joining us and look forward to having you back on anytime to talk about this and any other issue.
Thank you.